Is South Africa a nation that believes in solving problems through violence? Well, Archbishop Thabo Makgoba is raising concerns over the high levels of aggression seen in many areas of our society. Makgoba says violent behavior in the mining industry during strikes is worrying. He's also highlighting the recent violence in schools as well as the service delivery protests that usually end with the destruction of public property. The Archbishop joins me now. Good evening, Arch. Thank you very much for your time. And we're talking about this on a day we are seeing the bomb blasts in Nairobi today, as well as the protests that turned violent in Zimbabwe yesterday and today. And it does look like people continue to want to see resolutions to, yes, perhaps, problems that need resolution, but violence definitely not the way to go, is what you're arguing.
Yes, Vuyo. Let me start by saying compliments to all South Africans and Africans. It does worry me a great deal that we don't seem to learn that violence begets violence. We tend to just quickly rush to pull somebody down and let me throttle him instead of just taking a deep breath. From a Christian theological perspective, each one of us is made in the image of God. And if we can respect that, we might actually reduce the amount of violence that we see. And it is regrettable that Nairobi today and Zimbabwe yesterday, as you said, once again has demonstrated that which I bemoaned over my Christmas sermon.
I have heard people, Archers, and I've heard people saying during service delivery protests that it would seem that violence is the only language that the government understand, that unless you turn violent, they will never do anything about the plight, especially of the poor who may not have a voice within the upper echelons of those who may be in charge politically or who may be in charge in the business environment or even in church environments at times, as we have seen from some of the standoffs that have affected churches like the International Pentecostal Holiness Church in Limpopo.
Vuyo, even in all those examples, violence doesn't achieve much. It destroys property. It demeans the very person that is violent against property and the others. And then finally, people have to sit down and resolve the issues. And I'm saying we need to find a way in which we can disagree as South Africans without resorting to violence. What is that way? I may not have the specifics at the moment, but violence, by the time the politicians listen, a number of people have died, libraries have been burned, the very hospitals that are supposed to serve us are burned down. The teachers are killed, the pupils are scared. So it is not sustainable, much as it may attain a particular end, but the means just demeans everybody.
Every time there's an election, Arch, we usually see religious leaders speaking to politicians and praying for them. But beyond prayer, what is it that can be done to ensure that as we go into an election period, which you too say is going to be a very highly contested poll. What should we do differently this time around to make sure that as political leaders crisscross the country, making their promises, politicking and taking swipes at one another, this is done without violence being part of what will happen?
Vuyo, I think and I hope that all our politicians do read the IEC Electoral Code of Conduct, because it is very clear in terms of encouraging them not to perpetrate violence. And the Constitution also encourages freedom of association, freedom of movement. I hope they will really look at those two. I mean, from a theological, biblical perspective, and as a Christian also leader, I encourage them to also remember that we are all on the same side. We want South Africa to be the winner. We want the poorest of the poor to be served. We want equity and equality of opportunity. So if they can realize that they are contesting power and not contesting the life of the other, I think we will have less violence. And as the Western Cape Religious Leaders Forum, for example, we have been meeting since last year under the umbrella of ECOC, which is an electoral examination commission, to look at how beyond prayer we could walk around every polling station, assess what we call the hotspot, mediate and intervene now before the politicians and others start fueling violence or inciting people. So that is one way in which we can move beyond just praying.
You don't think, Arch, perhaps we quickly did away with some of the things that helped us a great deal, especially during the late 80s and the early 1990s? There was a great deal of focus on mediation and conciliation. And when I look around at some of the people who were integrally involved in those processes, some of them have actually disappeared. And when one looks at what is happening between AMCU and the NUM, for example, which may just be a recipe for another disaster or a Marikana in the making, one wonders whether perhaps we shouldn't go back to those things that helped us in the Vaal during the violence that we saw between and within supporters of particular political parties and rival organizations.
Vuyo, for example, although we don't do some of these interventions like with the same intensity as in the 80s, we are still meeting at Bishop Scott's at my home under what we call courageous conversations. We've got almost all the mining formations like trade unions, a lot of mining CEOs, and a number of people representing the communities and the faith leaders from within those communities. We've been meeting for the last 4 years to say, how do we disagree as different trade unions with different ideological emphasis, but without hacking each other? We're not yet there, but at least courageous conversation does bring, for example, solidarity, it does bring NUM, it does bring AMCU around the table. And then last year, the government was also around the table. And then we hope that those little efforts, will remind us of the importance of building South Africa instead of really hacking each other. because, like I said in my Christmas message, the sources of darkness and violence should be buried. We should really focus on what can build us. We shouldn't really give up on the projects called South Africa.
Archbishop, thank you very much for your time and insights this evening. He is the Archbishop of the Anglican Church, Archbishop Thabo Makgoba.